What's up guys, CJ here, and welcome back to another all-new Hybrid Network video, this time the first installment of a new series we like to call Screen Study. What is Screen Study exactly? Well, every Thursday we'll be taking a deep dive into a complex issue in the entertainment world, or a trend or theme in film or television, and we'll be presenting an objective analysis of the situation. Like I said, whether it's just about a specific technique or a complicated world event. And we decided the best way to kick off this new series was to dive headfirst into one of the most complicated, controversial, and downright divisive issues in Hollywood today, Kathleen Kennedy's stewardship of Lucasfilm and the Star Wars franchise specifically, and asking the question, has it been successful? Again, the goal here is for this to be as fact-based as possible. It's going to be an objective look at her tenure, Disney's performance financially, critically, and with the fans, as well as other hot-button issues that have come up. But feel free to let me know your own personal opinions in the comment section down below. Kathleen Kennedy got her start as an assistant to legendary writer, director, and producer John Milius, who you might know best as the writer of films from Dirty Harry to Hunt for the Red October. He was also a frequent collaborator with Steven Spielberg on movies like Jaws and 1941. While working together with Spielberg on 1941, the legendary director hired Kennedy as his own personal assistant, and this is where Kennedy's career really took off. According to Spielberg, she had a knack for good production ideas and quickly began receiving producer credit literally within 2 years of working with the director. Since then, Kennedy has been a frequent collaborator with Spielberg, co-founding Amblin Entertainment with him and her future husband Frank Marshall, and served as president of that company until 1992. Fast forwarding, in 2012, she became co-chair of Lucasfilm with George himself, with the company's plan that she would replace him as chairman in 2013. At the same time, Lucas was planning to retire and began discussions with Disney CEO Bob Iger about his intent to sell the company and the Star Wars franchise. This, of course, eventually happened in October of 2012, when Disney acquired Lucasfilm for $4 billion, resulting in Lucas retiring and Kennedy being promoted to president of the company early, reporting directly to the chairman of Walt Disney Studios, Alan Horn. Disney's acquisition and Kennedy's promotion marked the beginning of a new era for Lucasfilm, and I mean that literally, not just to be dramatic. The idea was to build the brand to new heights through new television series, books, comics, video games, and of course, new movies. To Kennedy's credit, she's taken Star Wars from being one of the most well-known film franchises in history and elevated it even further into a powerhouse global brand with a full-court press. In less than 6 years, Disney's made $4.8 billion at the box office, recouping their $4 billion payment and then some, and that's not even counting DVD and Blu-ray sales, comics, books, video games, and more. After Disney's acquisition, production began almost immediately on Episode 7, a continuation of the Skywalker saga with a new generation taking the reins from the old. Famously, the final script was done by J.J. Abrams and legendary Star Wars scribe Lawrence Kasdan after Disney discarded Lucas's own story outlines for the new trilogy. The result? Well, the film was a smash hit at the box office, finishing as the third highest grossing movie of all time worldwide, bringing in more than $2 billion when all was said and done. Critically, it was a darling as well, with a 97% on Rotten Tomatoes on an average rating of 8.2 out of 10 and an audience score of 87%. For those of you that don't like Rotten Tomatoes, Metacritic has it at an 81, which lines up pretty perfectly with that 8.2 average score on RT. But one of Kennedy and Disney's most controversial decisions was to expand the franchise with spin-off films titled Star Wars Stories set outside the main saga of films, which would free up the studio to explore events in the universe on screen for the first time ever. The first of these, Rogue One, tells the story immediately before the start of Episode 4, the heist of the Death Star plans that sets off the events of A New Hope. The film famously was a rocky start for the Star Wars spin-offs behind the scenes, with director Gareth Edwards sidelined in reshoots as writer Tony Gilroy came in to rework, rewrite, and basically direct the entire third act. However, the film was still a financial and critical success, bringing more than $1 billion worldwide with an 85% on Rotten Tomatoes and an audience score actually higher at 87%. All eyes then turned to The Last Jedi. For fans of The Force Awakens, it was a chance to build on the new pieces that worked in the first film. For critics, it promised an original story, not just a rehash of the events of a previous film, one of the biggest critiques of Episode 7. What was delivered was highly controversial, to say the least, and split the audience and the fan base in general in two. It was more or less wholly original, but the choices director Rian Johnson took with certain characters and storylines didn't sit well with some, to say the least. The film still performed well with critics, sitting at a 90% on Rotten Tomatoes on an 8.1 average rating and bringing in $1.3 billion when all was said and done, but the audience score was dismal. It's a whopping 46%, almost half of the critics' score. Now, some have alleged that this may have been altered or artificially manipulated by campaigns meant to affect the film's box office by tanking audience scores, but more on that in just a minute, because now we've got to talk Solo. Solo: A Star Wars Story was always seen as an interesting project. It's an origin story for Han Solo, which is a character we've already seen in 4 films, which basically seemed unnecessary to some observers and casual fans, and many diehard fans had already checked out on the movie after their disappointment with The Last Jedi. On top of all that, the film had well-publicized production troubles, parting ways with directors Phil Lord and Chris Miller with literally 2 weeks left in principal photography, and thereafter replacing them with Ron Howard, who completed filming in more or less, under a month. With those issues and a crowded release month in May with Avengers Infinity War and Deadpool 2 coming out just weeks before, the film couldn't really be described as anything other than a disappointment financially, bringing in just $390 million worldwide. Critically, it did not fare much better, coming in at 71% on Rotten Tomatoes, an average rating of 6.4 out of 10, and an audience score even lower at 64%. There are multiple factors that could be discussed when talking about why Solo flopped the way it did. The crowded release window I mentioned, fatigue is part of that last trend, audience disinterest in a Solo origin story, but one thing that can't be discounted is the boycott Solo movement. The boycott Solo movement, as described by people that consider themselves part of the movement, was born as a direct response to The Last Jedi, and more generally, Disney's handling of the franchise as a whole. This opposition existed before The Last Jedi and actually has its roots in the earliest days of Disney's control of the franchise. Specifically, I'm talking about the decision to wipe the slate clean and declare the expanded universe no longer officially canonical, or even part of the larger story of Star Wars. For those of you out there that are too young or just don't know, the expanded universe was the term used to refer to everything Star Wars outside of the movies, so books, comics, video games, you name it, they were all part of one big story. And when Disney took over, they wiped all of those out to give themselves as much room as possible for new films, video games, comic books, and more. This was met with massive backlash from die-hard fans, because for so many of them, the expanded universe was literally what they grew up on. I mean, if you were a Star Wars fan growing up between the release of Episode 6 and Episode 1, like I did, or after Episode 3, a new Star Wars book or video game was the way the story continued for you, especially when it didn't look like Lucas was going to make any more movies after Episode 3. Many fans were also uncomfortable with what they perceived as the icing out of George Lucas, the discarding of his ideas for the new trilogy, and a general disdain at Disney for the prequels. I will say this was a problem that has gotten better over time because the prequels were pretty heavily embraced in Solo, but it's also worth noting that when Lucas sold the franchise, it was because he was retiring. He wasn't forced out after the sale. That's a common misconception. A big part of the opposition also has its roots in what some fans claim is Disney forcing a political agenda into their films, with an emphasis on diversity and social justice warrior ideology. Specifically, they cite prominent roles for characters like Admiral Holdo, Finn, and Rose Tico, as well as Rey's power level and her abilities, given that she doesn't have really much training at all, as proof of Disney injecting forced diversity and forced feminism specifically into these movies. Whether you believe in that or not, it seems like Episode 8, for better or worse, was a major turning point because it got more casual fans involved in the opposition. The movie took some major risks with certain characters with the intention of subverting expectations, with mixed response. Luke isn't the uber-powerful, optimistic Jedi Grandmaster you thought he'd be. Instead, he's turned away from the Jedi and is living out the rest of his days in self-imposed exile. Rey's parents, well, they weren't Luke or Mara Jade or Leia or Han. Instead, they were nobody, and Big Bad Snoke got cut in half by his own apprentice halfway through the film, leaving his origin and his whole character basically in the wind. These are obviously directorial choices made by Rian Johnson, but the film was made with the approval of Lucasfilm, something that the firing of Lord and Miller makes clear isn't always easy to keep. It makes you wonder if they were just overcorrecting based on criticism to The Force Awakens. Ultimately, this is a really tricky situation. From a financial and critical perspective, Disney has had an unprecedented and maybe even better than expected run with Star Wars in the Kathleen Kennedy era. But at the same time, the films have absolutely divided the fan base, and Solo's struggles show that at the top, Disney may have overestimated the general public's level of interest in everything Star Wars. It's clear that something has to be done, but the question is, what do you do? I mean, do you part ways with Kennedy, who was handpicked by Lucas and responsible for $4.8 billion in profit in just 4 films? Or do you keep her and risk alienating the fan base further? There's no good answer, and there likely won't be one for a while. But let me know in the comment section down below what you think and where you fall on this debate. Do you dislike Kathleen Kennedy and what she's done with these films and you want her gone? I mean, do you see her as the architect of everything that you dislike about these movies? Or do you think that she's actually done a pretty good job and, it's obviously not all on one person and it's more of something from individual directors? Maybe Disney needs to be smarter about which projects they choose. Or are you completely positive? You love all the films they've put out and you love what they're doing and you want to see more of it? That's going to do it for me here, though. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to smash that like if you like what you saw, subscribe for more great content every single day, and consider turning on your notifications to be alerted every time we upload a new video. Signing off, this is CJ, and I'll see you next time